No, not at all. No signs of progress at all up here, George. Both sides emerged from that meeting calling it frank. Now, you know, in international politics anyway, when diplomats describe a meeting as frank, it usually means they vehemently disagreed or they're on the verge of war. I talked to a prominent House Democrat late last night who told me simply, get your parachute ready. We are going over the cliff. Meanwhile, George, I can tell you, Congress
used on my show on CNBC yesterday was this, Mika. If you loan me $1 and I pay you back a nickel, right, I still owe you 95 cents. But if 95% of our discussion is about the nickel and not the 95 cents, that's the analogy to what we're talking about, because everybody knows that the tax hike on the wealthy, which I have argued for, just to get it off the table, is such a fractional amount of our problem, but it's taking up almost all of our dialogue, and to me, it's just insane. It doesn't make any sense. Pass it and get it done, because we've got so many bigger problems than this. That tax hike, by the way, if the president's assumptions are correct, is already spent multiple times over. Right. The U.S. Post Office is $15 billion in debt. The FHA is $15 billion in debt. Those two alone almost eat up all the revenue from the tax hike next year just for those two things.
Well, it's the easy part at this point. The question is how then to get the hard part through, which would be legitimate spending cuts, changes to our entitlement programs that make them more solvent. And I would think the only way that happens is if they agree to do it together, that they don't lay it on one or the other. Who do you think of the two has the guts to do that?
I don't think either of them have the guts, Mika. And I spoke with some Congress folks about this, you know, off the record or sort of off camera. And I said, guys, it seems clear that both parties don't want to be the one to have to tell the American people the truth. Right. They don't want to have to say, I'm sorry, because when you're talking about health care, you're talking about people's lives, their mothers, their brothers, their children, their grandparents. It's an emotional issue. So they don't want to have to be, they're trying to force the other party to be the ones that go and say, I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut back on medical care for mom. And politically, that is extremely difficult to do. That's why I worry. Nobody wants to be the grown-up in the room to deliver the bad news. And I'll leave you with this. In 1967, a couple years after Medicare started, it spent $3 billion, which is about 20 to 25 billion in today's dollars. It now spends more than 500 billion a year. It's had a 20,000% increase in spending. We have a 63 trillion with a T structural deficit for Medicare and Social Security by 2035.
Raise tax rates on wealthy people. Previously, he said, we'll get more money out of wealthy people by limiting deductions. This is a very important move, a step towards a deal by Speaker Boehner. He's saying you can have higher tax rates on incomes over $1 million a year. He's matched the principle from President Obama that we have higher tax rates on people making more than $250,000 a year. So the two sides are still far apart, but they're united on the principle of higher tax rates. It is a very important development.
It is. I mean, there were some Republicans that were saying, look, you're not going to be able to get away without raising tax rates, at least on people making over $1 million.
Yes.
Okay. But I'm wondering, in these private meetings that the Speaker has held with the President, you know, now this information is trickling out. The President must have acquiesced on some of the spending cuts,
we don't
or maybe
know that.
Not.
No, we simply don't know that. I have no idea whether he acquiesced on spending cuts and entitlement reform or not. But the ball is now in the President's court. Speaker Boehner has stepped up. Okay, raise tax rates on the very rich.
But see, I don't think the ball is necessarily in the President's court, because he's just going to come back and say, nope, it's not good enough. We want to raise rates on people over $250,000.
Of course he could come back exactly like that. He could stay hard on his position. But doing that would make it more the President's fault if we go over the cliff, because he's not responded to this retreat by Speaker Boehner. I think the two sides, they're still far apart. $1 million versus $250,000, but that can be negotiated away. Granted, there's not much time, but they are a little closer together because they are united on principle. But any way you slice it, whether it's higher rates on $250 or $1 million, doesn't matter. This is not going to solve our deficit problem, period. It is a spending problem, and unless we address entitlement reform, we will not make significant progress on our mounting debt, period.
What steps will the Obama administration take to address the federal government's deficit and debt? What specific tax measures and/or program changes will you recommend to Congress?
This has been the fiscally most irresponsible administration that we have seen. I mean, we have increased the national debt, almost doubled it since George Bush took office. It is now over $9 trillion. And that is money that we're all going to have to pay back. So we are using our resources in a way that's not sound. Second principle is a very simple principle called pay-go. If you want to cut taxes, you've got to cut spending. If you want to raise spending, you've got to raise revenue, so that you have honest accounting. Right now, the federal budget is not honest. And unless we have good numbers, we can't end up dealing with this budget issue. Now, the biggest problem we have in terms of our budget, though, long term, and look, I want to eliminate no-bid contracts. I want to scrub the federal budget free of earmarks and pet projects that are not based on our national priorities. And that requires transparency in government. I talked earlier about the power of technology. One of the things that we've done, you'll be pleased to know that we call this the Google for Government bill.
And Google is in favor of it.
Yes. And what it does is we're going to set up a searchable database for every dollar of federal spending so that we can track it, which means that we'll be able to, journalists and ordinary citizens and think tanks and advocacy groups will be able to see if money is going to a bridge to nowhere instead of going to a bridge to somewhere. We'll be able to challenge it in real time, and that's going to be important. But the last thing I was going to mention, and this is probably the biggest problem we have with the federal budget, is healthcare spending, Medicare and Medicaid. That's the big budget buster. That's the scary thing out there that will be like the blob. It will just consume everything unless we do something about it now. And again, technology is part of the answer, and innovation is going to be part of the answer in reducing these costs. The reason that healthcare costs are skyrocketing, it's not so much that the population is getting older. That contributes a little bit to it. But the main problem is healthcare inflation goes up 6, 8, 10% per year. It's unsustainable. That will probably be the biggest savings item for our federal budget if we do it right, and people like yourselves can be a part of it.